One common idea in fantasy media is the idea of segmenting a broad fantasy race into different subcultures, usually with each culture being associated with their own aesthetics, geography, and even physical appearance. Despite Lord of the Rings being the foundation of modern fantasy, not so many people are as familiar with the many types of elf defined in Lord of the Rings as they are with the concept of elves and dwarves more generally. This is something that I think is very interesting because Lord of the Rings is the bedrock upon which the vast majority of fantasy is built on, and yet a huge chunk of people couldn't tell you the difference between a Noldor elf and a Sindarin, if they even know of that distinction in the first place. Really, when it comes to elven fantasy subcultures, modern fantasy more or less recognizes three main types: high elves, wood elves, and dark elves. Warhammer, of course, recognizes this delineation to a massive degree, so much so that each flavor of elves is recognized as their own type of faction. We have the High Elves, haughty and aloof, both martial and magical, and also probably the closest Warhammer Fantasy has to a protagonist faction. Dark Elves are also haughty and aloof, but full of murderous greed and malice. They also live in Warhammer Fantasy's version of America, so make of that what you will. Lastly, the Wood Elves are also haughty and aloof, but mysterious, and they also live inside a magical forest, and they have access to tree friends to make up for the fact that they're much squishier than the regular elves. Bear in mind that they're all still elves, they're not some different species. For some of these elves, the schism that separated their people is still sort of within living memory, and yet we recognize that culturally they're all separate from each other, and that by representing them with different army books, we acknowledge that those differences are meaningful. Although to the average citizen of the Empire, or the average person in general, it feels like the gap between themselves and the Stirlander next door might as well be the same sort of cultural gulf. What is less recognized, however, is that there are subcultures of the dwarves, and that's what this video is about. If you're a casual Warhammer Fantasy fan, or you just don't know much about the setting, you can easily be forgiven for not knowing much about the various dwarf subcultures, or that there even are dwarf subcultures. Historically, dwarfs were confined to a single army book, which means that a lot of the nuances of the dwarf subcultures have been pushed to the margins of the lore. With the release of Total Warhammer 3, and now, of course, the actual print release of Warhammer the Old World, Chaos Dwarfs are finally being talked about in a more mainstream way. They've always existed in the lore, and they've been in the game since at least the 3rd edition, at least as potential allies for Chaos armies, but really, it was given that they existed, they just didn't have an army book. It took until 4th edition for a supplement of them to actually come out. And then that was all they got until Old World came out and actually released some real proper kits. With Games Workshop, I find that canonicity and the primacy of a piece of lore really depends on whether or not Games Workshop can sell you a mini to support it. If they can sell you something, then they believe in it. If they can't sell you something, then it's questionable. A lot of things that were once in the lore of Warhammer Fantasy are no longer because, of course, they stopped selling the models. The Chaos Dwarfs are culturally very interesting, being a distorted and twisted version of their non-Chaos kin. They worship a Chaos entity, a god called a Shoot, a bull-headed creature which grants them, amongst other things, the ability to use magic, which is, of course, as you know, a taboo in regular dwarf society. And this is something that I think is very interesting. That's the twisting power of chaos for you. They're also a very slave-based society, with Chaos Dwarfs enslaving whoever they wish, or whoever they can get away with, to continue working on their hellish forges and factories. It's now established that a lot of the Chaos armor worn by Chaos Warriors is made by Chaos Dwarfs, not to mention basically all of their war machines. Chaos Dwarfs are always willing to trade war machines for slaves or plunder, but, I don't want to spend too much time on them. I foresee that in the future, Chaos Dwarves are probably going to be expanded into a proper army with all the support and love you'd expect to see of a regular Warhammer Fantasy faction. I know that there are probably a lot of Chaos Dwarf fans out there, some probably even in my audience, but, these are the most mainstream of all the dwarven subcultures that exist. I think we want to talk a little bit more about dwarf subcultures that are even less common. To find our next dwarf subculture, we have to leave the wastelands of the southern Badlands and journey far north, past the World's Edge Mountains, into the frozen wastelands of Norska, specifically to the Giant Home mountain range. Here, situated amidst the frozen mountains, lie a series of 4 dwarven holds: Kraka Drak, Kraka Dorden, Kraka Ornsmotek, and Kraka Ravensvak, though technically Ornsmotek is not in Giant Home. Sea of Claws, a guidebook for the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, establishes the lore for the Norse dwarves. They, like their southern cousins, and even southerner cousins, migrated sometimes from the holds of their main people in around the year minus 4540 Imperial calendar. That's even before the Chaos Dwarves deviated, making them ancient indeed. You might expect that Norse dwarves to be somewhat chaosy, but that's furthest from the truth. In fact, they probably lean a lot more on the Norse Scandinavian influence than you'd see in the mainline dwarf faction. Their names are a lot more Norse-inspired. They even have a fleet of longships that they built after studying captured Norscan ones. They are, for all intents and purposes, just Scandinavian dwarfs, which, if you know anything about dwarf lore, maybe actually brings them a lot closer to the original conception of dwarfs, but I digress. They don't worship chaos, but not really beholden to the traditions of their cousins in the World's Edge Mountains. They trade and they war frequently with different Norscan tribes, and while they prize smithing and forging, their access to the more advanced technologies of their southern kin is more limited. You might imagine that if they have a cannon, that might be the only cannon that they've ever had. And their ability to replace it if it gets broken or lost, well, that probably would be more limited. I gotta say that the idea of Norse dwarfs is very interesting to me. In a lot of fantasy media, you tend to see northern influences in dwarf depictions. Maybe the dwarfs have a Nordic or usually Scottish accent. All dwarfs have runes, but these ones go a step further by incorporating trade and commerce raiding into their daily life, just like actual historical Vikings did. These dwarfs even take it a step further, having fought in the Great War against Chaos, although primarily as a naval fleet. So, if you're looking for your next big Warhammer conversion project, I think a Norse dwarf army would be great to see. You can post any pics in my Discord, and I will certainly shout you out on this channel. But I think we want to go even a little bit more obscure. The final set of dwarfs are the ones that are probably the least talked about, the ones that are least likely to get an army book, but to be honest, they're probably my favorite, and they're the fanciest dressed. I'm talking, of course, about Imperial dwarfs. When I say Imperial, I mean Imperial from, obviously, the Empire. Imperials and dwarfs have a very long-standing alliance, probably the most long-standing alliance in the entire history of Warhammer Fantasy, and this was one that was cemented in the way that all alliances are, after a famous victory of Sigmar Heldenhammer at the Battle of Blackfire Pass. As part of that victory, Sigmar invited many dwarfs to settle into the Empire and to pass along their knowledge of construction and metallurgy. And this, of course, is a key point. In the aftermath of the devastation of those times, many dwarfs took up this call, and soon they would be forming their own settlements, their own enclaves, in towns and cities in the Empire. While always a part of the Empire, since basically its founding, the favorability of these Imperial dwarfs in human society waxes and wanes. In tumultuous times, they might find themselves as a persecuted minority. In more favorable times, they're honored guests. Many actually signed up to fight in the Great War against Chaos, in, of course, the time of Magnus the Pious, and you can, in Warhammer the Old World, include Imperial dwarfs in your army as mercenaries. But here's the thing. The thing that I find most fascinating about Imperial dwarfs is that they are the most cosmopolitan of all the dwarfs. They live in human cities, surrounded by us, and yet they're also at our mercy. The constant social tension, I think, makes for a very interesting cultural study as to how dwarfs adapt to living amongst humans and vice versa. It is undeniable that humans benefited from our proximity to dwarfs, as pretty much all the full plate armor in the Empire is forged by them. But the Empire, and this is the key point, would not be a nation of imposing stone cities, grand cathedrals, and forged cannons if those dwarfs had not accepted Sigmar's call to live amongst humans thousands of years ago, right? I repeat that. Most of the human development of the Empire was kickstarted by the fact that the dwarfs were able to lend their expertise to this burgeoning nation. Without that expertise, the Empire would not be as advanced as it actually is. Furthermore, we can imagine that the proximity to humans marks Imperial dwarfs out from the rest of their dwarf kin. Dwarf society is famously conservative, and I'm sure that dwarf conservatism must surely bear the eye of mistrust upon any of those who dwell under the open sky in crowded cities, and far away from the orderly stone halls of their ancestors. City dwarfs wear clothing in the imperial style. They must know how to speak Rakespel, the language itself, of course, being influenced by dwarfs eons ago. They're different, is my point. They're different in a way that I think is very interesting. While we've only ever seen limited army compositions for Imperial dwarfs, I like to imagine that they'd fight probably closer in a manner to the Empire, making a wider use of tactics and troop types that you'd probably see in the Empire, but not see in the halls of their kin. Dwarfs with pikes? Why not? The Empire uses them. Dwarf cavalry? Maybe even, something like that. I think that this is a fascinating Imperial culture, and it's definitely something that I'm looking into in the future. You gotta watch this space for when I do an army review of my Imperial dwarf army. But there you have it, a series on dwarf subcultures that are maybe a little bit less well known in the lore. I hope that you definitely enjoyed this video. I've got, more planned as always. Remember to like, share, and comment and subscribe. Let me know which type of dwarf you like. For me, the city dwarfs are the coolest. Until next time, take care and goodbye.